The book, as you know, is a true crime. And it's a very tragic story of a crime that involved my family, a very grizzly, gruesome crime. So, of course, I never expected to be writing a book like The Crate. And in fact, I didn't even read true crime ever. I ended up writing it and had never read it. And in the book, I thought that for readers to really understand the impact that the crime had on my family, I had to put it into the context of my family life, of my parents' histories. And as a matter of fact, my parents are Holocaust survivors.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 208 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In this episode, I have a fascinating conversation with Deborah Levison, a multi-award-winning author, freelance writer, and publicist. Her debut book, The Crate, a story of war, a murder, and justice, is a true crime story with echoes of the Holocaust. Since its release in 2018, she has spoken to over 120 audiences from 5 to 500 people across the US, Canada, and the UK. New York Times bestselling authors Lee Child called it impressive and important, and James Rollins said it was a gut punch with such harrowing moments that you have to stop and take a breath. Treat yourself to this journey and be transformed. The Crate not only received 7 literary awards, but the discovery of The Crate, which propagated this book, actually turned Debbie's life upside down. And we'll hear about that and more in this fascinating interview that's coming up later in the episode. But first, let's hear a word from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. Findaway Voices is a platform that allows authors the opportunity to get their digital audiobook out into a global market of more than 43 retail and library channels. If you are looking for a narrator, you can use Findaway Voices to find a narrator. And what I love about working with Findaway is I don't have to sort through all of the auditions myself. What I do is if I'm looking for a narrator, I plug in the requirements that I'm looking for, and then a project manager at Findaway is assigned to finding me usually between 5 to 10 of the thousands of professionals that they have in their professional network of audiobook narrators. Now, if you already have the audiobook file ready to go, you can still leverage Findaway Voices for distribution. And the best thing about them, well, one of the best things about them is the fact that you can set and control your own price, which means you can do price promos and discounts. And they have promos available through Chirp, through Barnes & Noble Nook audiobooks, as well as through some other platforms. And you can leverage all of this and more, including coupon codes that you can give away to your customers, a platform that allows you to direct sale your audiobooks to the Authors Direct free app that's available. And you can leverage all of these things over at Findaway Voices. So if you're curious to see how you can use Findaway Voices to take your audiobook experience to the next level, check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. And now for some comments from recent episodes. So the first comment's actually coming from the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing newsletter, and that is a newsletter where I actually link to content from the episodes as well as other related content of interest to writers. And one of the things I shared was a graph. So Regina said in response to that newsletter, that graph on what... Wow, did you hear the cat sneeze? That was a really, really loud sneeze. I'm just going to leave that in there. Regina did not sneeze like a cat, but she said, that graph on what makes people purchase books is fascinating and refutes a lot of what we read from the go-to gurus and advisors. The cover, not as important as genre. Reviews, only 15%. Very helpful. Now, Regina, this is in reference to the episode where I had featured the two doctors, Norda and Behrens. And this was on the Panorama project where they had done the immersive... Wow, I'm tripping over my tongue. It's the cat sneeze. It's really the cat sneeze. But the immersive books and consumer media survey. Now, that survey was based on a survey of library patrons, so it was a little bit skewed that way. So it was a little bit more different in terms of that style. Now, what's interesting, though, is the cover, after somebody has decided to read, isn't as important as genre, because typically they're browsing by genre because they go into that section of the store, or even with online browsing. Now, the cover is important, and I think it's a little bit more subtle, where the consumer doesn't necessarily realize a bad cover from a good cover, especially when the cover works. So I think what happens is they get in, they're browsing it, they look at the cover, they obviously are going to flip over and read the description, but the cover is important, and if it's wrong, it's important, so that's why you need to get it right. And so I think I agree with what you say. It may not be as important as the genre, because you're like, well, okay, I just know this is the genre I'm going to enjoy, and who cares what the cover looks like? Like, who cares what the movie poster looks like if it's a genre I'm going to enjoy, or it stars an actor or actors that I enjoy, or it's a director I enjoy. I don't really care about that so much. You're going by genre, you're going by director, you're going by those things. And so I think a lot of book readers do the same thing. Like, so for example, I knew when Margaret Atwood released the Testaments, the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, I didn't care what the cover looked like. I was going to buy it. So the author and the genre were more important in that particular case. And of course, I read it right away, it hadn't actually... Well, it had been reviewed by the early reviewers, but again, it's not like I went online and went, well, of the 10,000 5-star reviews, one person didn't like it because, whatever. But that was cool. So thanks, Regina. If you're interested in additional news and content that comes out no more than twice a month, what I do is I link to some content from episodes and also share some other tidbits of things I'm looking at in the industry. You can subscribe to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing newsletter. Now, I got this wonderful, this next comment is from YouTube, because what I do is when I post my content through Libsyn to the various RSS feed to the podcatchers out in the world, I also have it posted to YouTube, just the audio only. So the audio only is available on YouTube, and then when I have permission from the guests and I've actually done my job and properly edited the video, there'll be a video of just the interview portion. But the episode of my rant on unprofessional author behavior appeared on YouTube, and D.F. Hart left this comment. Absolutely agree, Mark. Nobody wants to work with an unreliable flake in any industry. And in any publishing in particular, our integrity is especially important because, as you said, a misstep like this, especially when it's done intentionally, can have a ripple effect for years. Thanks so much for that comment. Yeah, I agree with you. It's just part of that overall branding, and you don't want to leave a stain on your reputation for behaving inappropriately. So thank you for that. And the last comment is actually coming in through my patron feed. It was actually a message I got from one of my patrons, and Stanley B. Trice messaged me to say, I'm catching up on my podcasts, and I wanted to comment on two recent ones. Episode 204, Overcoming Self-Doubt with Tessa Smith McGovern, and episode 206, No One Will Believe in You More Than You. These were great episodes to help me keep motivated. Sometimes it's hard to keep writing when no one is. These episodes were encouraging and give me hope that one day I will have a reader. Thanks, Stanley B. Trice. Thank you so much, Stanley, for sending me that message and agreeing that I could read it on the air. I am so glad that you were inspired by both Tessa and Stina Holmes, who was the one that No One Will Believe in You More Than You, which was a keynote she gave it When Words Collide. I listened to both of those several times, and every time I listen to them, I'm inspired in new ways. So I'm so delighted to hear that you also found those inspiring. Thank you so much, Stanley. And as I mentioned, Stanley is one of the amazing patrons of the Stark Reflection podcast, where patrons of the podcast get access to additional content. So there's additional opportunities to win some prizes when I have the opportunity to do some giveaways, but they get access to additional content, which includes some additional audio, some additional visuals to go with some of the episodes, as well as additional video content. And you can check that out if you're curious over at patreon.com/starkreflections. And now for a brief personal update. Gonna keep it brief because I got so many personal things going on. So this week I released Publishing Pitfalls for Authors on August 24th. And if it weren't for some really kind and generous folks in the Wide for the Win group who tagged me and said, "Hey Mark, I just got a notification from Amazon that you released a new book today," I would have potentially forgotten about it. And that's because, I wanted to get that book out the door because I'm working on the Relaxed Author with Joanna Penn and working on the audio book for that. So we've gone through, I was doing those two books in parallel. So I was working with my editor and then back and forth with Joanna and a proofreader on that. And yeah, it was just such a busy time. And then the minute I got, the different pieces done, I've been heads down on another project related to my favorite movie in the whole world, one of my favoriteest movies in the whole world, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I'm hoping to talk about that relatively soon. I am hoping, of course, my awesome publicist is trying to see if he can connect me with Ryan Reynolds, who I think would be interested in this project, because I'd love to just chat with him and get a quote from him for something that's related to him in this book. But that's one of the projects that's just been keeping me so crazy, so that when the book released on the 24th, all the assets and everything, I think I'd loaded by the 18th or 19th of August. Like that was 5 days ago. I'm on to new things, so I didn't even do anything. I didn't even send my publicist content so he could build a press release and send it out. So that's something I'll probably be doing in a few more weeks. But I am working on the audiobook for The Relaxed Author, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through that process. I have a bit more work to do on that in the next couple of days, so we can get that edited and put together and produced and mastered and all those things. But I'm going to go back right after I finish that, and I'm going to record the audiobook for Publishing Pitfalls for Authors. It is a shorter book. It has, I think it's maybe 30,000 words, so it won't quite take as long. It'll probably take as long, but it's going to be different because the recording for this book with Joanna is going through and recording the pieces that are me. And this one is just straight out me reading. So a little bit less of the gymnastics that I have to do to figure out what parts I'm going to read and what parts she's going to be reading. So that'll smooth it down a little bit, or quicken it a little bit. And then I do plan on going back and doing the audio for those other books in the Stark Publishing Solution series, like Wide for the Win and An Author's Guide to Working with Libraries, Bookstores, and Killing It on Kobo. I had put them off because I think when I went back to do Killing It on Kobo, when I started doing it, I went, I need to update some things. And there was so many visuals, and I kind of got bogged down by how to deal with the visuals. So I just went, and I put it aside and never picked it up. But working on this new book with Joanna has inspired me. Speaking of the new book with Joanna, it comes out September 18th, 2021. And it was so cool to see. It actually hit #1 in its category already. And it has the, #1 new release tag on Amazon. So that's a really cool ego-stroking thing to see. And I'm pretty thrilled. Pretty thrilled to have this new book out for writers, the one with Joanna. And then going back in and sinking my teeth into Fright Night's Big City. So lots going on. And that'll be it for the personal update right now. Why don't we get into this fascinating conversation with Debbie Levison? Hey, Debbie, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, Mark, thanks so much for having me.
It's so cool to get to chat with you. Before we get into the latest book you have published, I want to go back, look at your childhood. Did you always want to be a writer, or did that come later?
You know, it's so funny that you ask that, because that is exactly how I introduce myself to every audience, by saying that my earliest childhood memories are of hanging around in very dusty old libraries and sitting around reading stories on rainy days and wishing more than anything that I had a book on the shelf.
Oh,
You know,
wow.
I used to listen to my brother or my camp counselors tell ghost stories around a campfire. And, you know, just the feeling of storytelling, it was magical for me. I loved the way people could just sort of evoke emotions. I would feel shivers down my spine, or I'd be laughing or crying, whatever, mostly scared.
Yeah.
And that's, I just realized at a really early age, that's what I wanted to do. And maybe it was also because I couldn't do other things. Like I could not do math. I knew there was no math related profession for me in the cards.
You and
So
me both. So, do you remember the first time that you tried your hand at either telling a ghost story around a fire, or being a storyteller? Was it oral? Was it on paper? Like how did that go?
I remember one of the earliest essays I had to write for school. And it actually was set at my cottage, which figures really prominently in the crate. And it was a story of my mother, my grandmother, and I going to visit bears. We used to go every week to a garbage dump, and there would be this whole line of cars every Thursday night, 8 o'clock on the button, a line of cars with people, they dumped their garbage in the bin, and then they waited. And, you know, right on the stroke of 8, the mama bear would appear out of the woods. She'd have a couple of little cubs trailing after her.
Yeah.
And she would go sift through the garbage and feed her cubs. And this was like our entertainment. You know, we didn't have good television reception up in the woods. And so this was like our movie night, watching the mama bear. And so that's what I wrote about for a very, I don't know, it was like a very young age. I wrote this story and did really well on it. And that just sort of snowballed. You know, I just love to write. I love to write plays and act them out. And just sort of write continuations of the stories that I read at the library, like
Yeah.
additional chapters of Nancy Drew or Anne of Green Gables.
Wow. Were we separated at birth? Because two of the things you mentioned, I grew up in a small town in mid-northern Ontario. And our small
Which
town,
one?
it was a Levac, which is 45 minutes north of Sudbury, Ontario. And our small town didn't have a theater. It would be like an hour drive to go into the theater. But we had, in our small town, we would do the same thing. The cars would all pull up, and we would just sit there with snacks, and we would watch the bears eat. And that was our entertainment. We didn't have a drive-in, but we had a garbage dump. And then you talked about continuing stories. Like you would read a story or see a story, and then you would want to continue and continue, like what happens next, right? You always had that sort of curiosity?
Yeah. I mean, again, it was also because I had a pretty lonely childhood. We were very isolated in the summers growing up in Muskoka. So Muskoka is quite a bit south of Sudbury, but
Yeah,
I imagine
that was the far south for me.
practically Florida for you.
Yeah.
No, but you know, it was a very isolating experience to spend all that time alone in the woods with just usually just my mother and grandmother. My father would come up on the weekends. And so really books and the characters from books were my best friends, my companions.
Wow.
And so I don't remember a time where I didn't want to be an author, where I didn't want to have a book of my own. And then the question was always what to write.
Yeah.
And after college, after University of Toronto, I just sort of became a professional writer for the rest of my life, but more as a journalist and as a publicist, a ghostwriter, a freelance writer. And the author part of it came much later.
Yeah, so I want to get into that. So you started off with the very first essay that you wrote, or that you remember, or an early one, was that nonfiction about the bears in the cottage. And ironically, after this long journey and journalism and probably a lot of nonfiction writing and ghostwriting, like you said, then the book comes out, and it's almost like eerily, you foreshadowed that, didn't you,
Yeah.
somehow?
Yeah, it was full circle. It was a long time in between because I'm old now.
Old, yeah.
And but it really is full circle. And so one of the themes of the book that that I expand on is the question of fate. So the book, as you know, is a true crime.
Right.
And it's a very tragic story of a crime that involved my family, a very grisly, gruesome crime. So of course, I never expected to be writing a book like The Crate.
Right.
And in fact, I didn't even read true crime ever. I ended up writing it and had never read it.
Wow.
And in the book, I thought that for readers to really understand the impact that the crime had on my family, I had to put it into the context of my family life, of my parents' histories. And as a matter of fact, my parents are Holocaust survivors, which I didn't know as a child,
Oh.
but both of them survived the Holocaust. And so they're having that experience, that history, and having approached the crime through the eyes of people who had already experienced the ultimate in violence and the ultimate in evil. That was the context that I put the crime, the discovery, the investigation, the trial, and how it turns out I knew the murderer.
Whoa.
And so I sort of intertwined, evil in the past that my parents had experienced and
Right.
evil in the present with the crime. And so those stories are intertwined throughout the book.
So
But yeah, it totally comes full circle of having written about the cottage as my first foray into writing, and then having my debut book be set at my cottage.
I'm going to want you to just explain for my listeners a little bit about what The Crate is about, but I first have to comment. You made a joke that you're old, and then you said your parents were Holocaust survivors, and I'm looking at you going, there's no way that you have parents who were alive during the Holocaust. So
they were young. They were
okay.
young. My mother was a young teenager. She was 13.
Okay, because I'm thinking like, no, there's no possible way unless they had you like really late in life.
Well, they did. They actually did. My brother is 11 years older than me.
Okay.
He's my only sibling.
Because I'm guessing you're younger than me. So that's the thing. So that was just a bit of an aside. Because
I guess not. I think not. I have this very cool filter on Zoom that says improve your appearance. And I clicked it many times, hoping it would just keep improving.
All it does is it removes a zit from my face or something. That's all. It doesn't give me hair.
You're young enough to have zits.
They never go away. Okay, sorry. We a little bit of an aside. My apologies. But so yeah, could you please explain to my listeners what The Crate was about? Like, what's the true crime that prompted this?
Yeah, well, it actually dates back to a phone call from 2010, and absolutely the most surreal phone call I've ever gotten. My brother, my only sibling, who is a brilliant doctor known very well throughout Canada, he called my cell phone to say he had discovered this wooden crate underneath our cottage. So our cottage is Bracebridge, Muskoka, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto, and built in this just very pristine parcel of land on a very quiet lake. And really, for my parents, it was a sanctuary. It was a place that they built by hand. It was their safe refuge from all their memories of everything they'd gone through.
Wow.
And the place where I spent my whole childhood, growing up from the early 70s, really still until now. I still go back every summer.
Wow.
And so it was a place of real innocence for us. That's how I felt about it.
And then this crate.
And so my brother says he discovers this crate, and it's nailed really tightly shut, and shoved up really tightly underneath the crawl space, so between the ground and the floor of the cottage.
Right.
And eventually the crate gets pulled out and opened, and so the contents, were just the most awful thing you could ever imagine: a dismembered woman. And I don't mean old, not bones. I mean like identifiably
Oh, fresh.
tattoos, fresh.
Wow.
So and then, the discovery in the book, I talk about how the discovery just rocked my whole family. I had 3 young kids that I needed to really shield from the horror of this whole situation. My husband and I were totally freaked out. My brother became the primary murder suspect.
Oh, because he discovered it. Oh my
And the
God.
police had this, the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, they had this great theory of how and why he had committed this crime, and then called to say he discovered it. And then it was all over the media. It was the cover of a Toronto Life magazine issue a couple of years later. It was all over the headlines and television, and the media, the camera crews just descended on what for us was our very private property.
The sanctuary, right?
And the worst part was that my parents were traumatized because they had never expected to have to confront this kind of violence and evil. They thought they had left that all in the past.
Right. Wow.
And here it was right on their doorstep in the one place that they felt the safest.
Oh my God. Wow. That yeah, I can't even imagine what that was. And that was what, 2010 you said, right?
That was the discovery, yeah. And so the story goes on with the investigation, which took quite a while, and the trial and the conviction, and thankfully I was able to reach out to the victim's mother and sister and really get a sense of who she was. And so that's the whole second part of the book.
Oh, so you learned
and,
who she was then.
Oh yeah.
All right.
So here was the thing, it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but in those early days, right after the discovery, I was completely trapped in my own head. Like, how does this affect me and my immediate family?
Right.
And then it took a few days. Actually, it took until the autopsy results when we learned it was a young woman and a young mother. For it to sort of sink in that here's this poor young woman who's been brutally murdered, and her family is probably, grieving and reeling from this much more than we ever could, and
Wow.
And so the other thing was that the media reporting really was not fair to her. It was really a blame the victim kind of thing, talked about some of her more questionable choices. And eventually I started thinking, now we have all the platforms, the Me Too movement and the media, and people can tell their stories of being victimized. But here's this one young woman who no longer had a voice.
Right.
And I started thinking, okay, I could be her voice. I could tell her story.
Wow.
So I did.
So you did that. You explored the story of the family cottage, obviously how it dragged up horrors from the past for your parents. And then you said the second half of the book is an exploration of her and her life. And so you were in contact with her family just to flesh out some of those details?
Yeah. And it was just a crazy story of how I came to be in touch with them in the first place, which I mentioned in the acknowledgements at the end. But, I tried to get in touch with them. They have a fairly common last name. So
Right.
I went through the yellow pages and I called victim services from the courthouse where they had the trial. But of course, they wouldn't give me any contact information.
Right. Yeah.
I tried the police. I tried, whatever I could think of, couldn't find them until my kids said to me, well, did you try Facebook? And then I was like, duh. And I actually messaged both the mother and the sister, the people I thought were the mother and the sister, on Facebook, and they never answered. And here, meanwhile, I was under contract with a publisher who was telling me, you've got to dig deeper. And I'm thinking, I'm not an investigator. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to dig deeper. And he's saying, but you need more information about the victim. And I was, working away, finishing the book, and it was almost at the last minute before it started to go into edits that, and I think a year had gone by since I first contacted them. All of a sudden, one day I woke up to 2 messages on Facebook saying, Hi, we just saw your message. This is a year later.
Wow.
We both just saw your message. We'd love to talk to you about Samantha. Her name was Samantha.
Oh,
And so, it was like the 11th hour. They gave me all the information that made it into the book.
right.
So it was really her story in the
So you
end.
were actually able to tell Samantha's story from, yeah, that's good. Wow. So you talked about trying to research and trying to find them. So your background in journalism, how did that help, or did it hinder any of the work on the book?
Well, it's funny because people say, "Oh, I can tell from your writing that you were a journalist." I guess it's hard to shake like decades of being sort of a formal journalist.
Right.
And so I think there are definite swaths of the book where that comes through, where I have kind of my journalist hat on in the book, and the rest is more conversational. But but yeah, it's a completely different style of writing. But then it just goes, I keep going back to that theme of fate. I keep asking, was it Samantha's fate to end up the way she did, tucked away in some spidery crawl space in a wooden crate? And was it my parents' fate to survive everything that they went through and to survive at all when 6 million other people didn't?
Right.
And then was it my fate as a would-be author to have this story land in my lap? Like, how did the murderer choose the cottage of a professional writer who wanted to write a book?
Right.
Was it
Wow.
my fate to write Samantha's story and also tell my parents' Holocaust stories, which I feel really strongly about preserving, by the way?
Right. Wow. So that is so that ended up as your first book. So when this all started to come together, as you were pulling these pieces together, what was your process in terms of, okay, I now know this book I'm going to write. How did you find the publisher? How did you decide what you were going to do? I'm really curious to dig into that part.
Um, so, okay, how did I find a publisher? I had a friend who had just published a very different book on health,
Okay.
but it was a memoir. And I'm not supposed to say the crate is a memoir, even though it's written in first person and it's about my experience. But,
Oh, okay. Right.
apparently calling it a memoir is the kiss of death. Unless you're a celebrity, you don't call yourself a memoirist. But
Oh, that's right, because it's
um,
true crime, because you're talking about
yeah,
many crimes actually in the book, obviously.
right.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So this friend of mine had an agent friend. So I wrote up what I thought was a really great query letter, queried the agent. I had heard all these horror stories of agents waiting weeks or months to get back after a query letter. She got back to me in 15 minutes.
Whoa. Wow.
And I was blown away, and we started talking for like 6 weeks. We were emailing back and forth. She had all these great ideas for positioning the book, for some suggested edits, for what have you. And then after like 6 weeks, I kind of thought, don't we need a contract at this point? And she said, "Oh, I don't have time to represent you."
Oh, really? Wow. But she
So,
was really
so
passionate about this book happening.
yeah. So, and I was really feeling a time crunch because here
Right.
my parents were getting older. And I really wanted the book to come out since it was their stories.
Right. Right.
I wanted them to be on that journey of having the book published, and I wanted them to be there for the finished product. And so I really felt pressured for time to get it out. So after she said, "No, I don't have time," she suggested a true crime agent and sent, the query letter off to this new agent. Again, she got back to me 15 minutes later and ended up reading the manuscript over the weekend. We signed a contract on Monday and she started pitching. And
Wow.
she thought because so much of the book is set in Canada, it would make sense to try some Canadian publishers
Right.
first. And, as we had talked about earlier, Canadian publishers are really heavily subsidized by the government. And because I no longer am a resident of Canada, they passed. So then
Wow.
she started into the American, the big five. And all across the board, it was always the same story. Love your writing, but And then it was either we don't publish Canadian crime, or the story is too grisly for us, or, you know, whatever it was.
Wow.
Love your writing, but. And it was really tough to find. Anyway, I ended up getting a couple of offers, one from New York and one from Colorado. And here I thought, oh, I'll have lunches at the Plaza Hotel with my editor from New York. And so we went with the New York editor. And that acquiring editor, you know, acquired the book and then ended up leaving to get married, which left the crate orphaned, right? That's what they call it. It was orphaned at the publisher. No one left to champion it. And so a year after acquiring the book that I had been under contract with them, they dropped it, a year to the day.
Oh, wow.
So now another year had gone by wasted, and here I'm feeling this time crunch. So I went back to I had to get a new agent, so start from scratch, new agent, who I still have now. And we went back to the Colorado publishers, who actually put the book out pretty fast. So that was fantastic. They got it out. It had been so heavily edited already at that point. So
wow.
well, kind of brutal.
quite the journey to get there. And then, so I'm looking at, you've got Lee Child calling the book impressive and important. Never heard of this Lee Child guy you speak of. James Rollins said it was a gut punch and such harrowing moments that you have to stop and take a breath. Treat yourself to this journey and be transformed. It's been called gorgeous and poetic, heart-wrenching, and the Jerusalem Post wrote exquisite. And then you also have a brilliant story. Okay, so how did you get these great testimonials from? Was that the agent, the publisher, or did you know these folks? How did you get in front of them?
So getting the blurbs, I think, was one of the main marketing tools that, and you know, I'm a publicist as my background, so I did a lot of my own marketing.
Okay.
But I went to ThrillerFest. I went to a couple of ThrillerFest conferences in New York.
I think two of those people were probably there.
They were, so
headliners.
So there was one, I had just, I mean, this is my favorite moment of my life. Like, it's right up there with having children. I had just finished a panel, and I was standing talking with a couple of people, and I got a tap on my shoulder, and I look up, and like up, and it's Lee Child.
Because he's not a short man.
And he's holding a copy of my book. And he says, I started reading it last night and I'm loving it.
Whoa.
And I'm like, for like the rest of the
And after you picked yourself up from the floor after fainting, what happened?
So then I didn't hear from him for a very long time.
Wow.
And it wasn't until I heard that he was coming to do a presentation in New York City, which is not far from where I live. And it happened that I knew the owners of the bookstore where he was appearing.
Oh.
So I called them up and I said, hey, I've been trying to find Lee. Can you pass along a message? I just wanted to know if he'd finished the book and what he thought. And he said, oh yeah, I finished it. It was powerful, and sent me a whole email. And
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is like a dream come true.
Absolutely.
To have an author of that magnitude standing over you, because he's a tall man. but just with the book in hand, did you sign it for him when he was there?
I was too busy lifting my chin up from the floor at that point. Wow. But I also met James Rollins, and like, you could not meet a nicer guy. You know, I was so nervous going up to him, but He was so generous with his time. He read the book on a flight to, I think, Iceland. And he was emailing me saying, you know, the light was keeping him up at night, so he was reading.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like, because you got an American publisher, you probably got more opportunity, because Canada is a beautiful, gigantic country, but population-wise, we're pretty small. About the state of California is about the same population. So going with an American publisher has probably opened up opportunities in the American market that would probably not be as easy for you to get from Canada, I'm guessing. Is that a possibility?
Well, I don't know how to comment on that since I have no experience from being
Right.
north of the border publishing, except to say that I have a bunch of author friends who are doing, fantastically well with their books in the States. So I think distribution has changed, and especially online, Amazon, you can get anywhere.
Right.
And all the new self-publishing avenues, Kobo and all the other distributors online are making the marketplace so much smaller, right?
Yeah, that is true. So the book is available in ebook. The book is available. I see print copies behind you. I hope you hold one up for anyone who's watching this. All right, cool. Thank you for doing that.
And audio, which
And
I love.
audio.
Audio.
I
I
was gonna
actually
ask.
got an audio deal before I got a print deal.
Really?
Yeah, like
Who
with
did the
a nice
audio?
advance, and so this is a whole set of
CD.
CDs.
Oh
It's
my
on CD as well as digital
Of
audio.
course. So who did the audio, I have to ask?
Tantor.
Oh,
Tantor Media. Yeah.
right.
And
Well,
my narrator is brilliant.
who was the
She
narrator?
Cassandra Campbell.
Okay.
She has won every audio award. She's in the Audio Hall of Fame. She did like tremendous books. So I'm just so honored to have her voice. She did The Crawdads. She did Lilac Girls, James and the Giant Peach,
Wow.
The
Wow.
Help. Huge books. So I'm just honored to have
Wow.
her.
Well, I'm gonna get the audiobook on Kobo, of course. That's where I have to pick it up. So that is
Okay.
awesome. Congratulations with that. So when did this come out?
2018.
Sorry?
2018.
2018. Okay. And you've obviously gotten lots of rave reviews on that. So you hadn't been expecting to write a true crime memoir. I want to get into the logistics of the writing of it again, because normally as a journalist, you observe and report on the 5 Ws, right? But you're an integral part of the story, or at least your family is an integral part of the story. How did you balance that from what your history had taught you in terms of reporting?
So, I felt pretty free to quote whatever was public knowledge at that point.
Okay.
Clearly the case was in the court system. It had been filed when I was writing, and so it was all public domain.
Right.
And so I quoted some of the media. I was able to meet with the lead investigator,
Whoa.
who's actually the guy who interviewed my brother as a suspect. And my brother was just, shaking. He said afterwards, he said he was hauled into a police station. It was just like an episode of Law and Order with
Wow.
these very formal, very cold and efficient policemen interviewing him, interrogating him.
Wow.
And it turns out that the guy who was so efficient in his job actually came up to our cottage, had dinner, showed us his PowerPoint that he teaches younger officers about the case. The case won investigation of the year.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, because they did find the murderer.
Yeah, they were able to lock it up, get a verdict, and it was just so clever the way they put all the clues together. And because there was, it was very circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime. There was no DNA, and so they were very, very clever. Which, the lesson it taught me was that you can't get away with murder. The police will definitely figure it out. But the investigator, Dave Allen, was just a pussycat and very, very generous with his information and his knowledge. So I used quite a bit of that in the book too.
Wow.
And it was intimate, it was a really intimate story of my family, of my parents and my relatives in Eastern Europe who'd perished.
Right.
And all the emotions surrounding growing up as a child of Holocaust survivors, and what the cottage meant to us, and sort of how violence can change the texture of a place.
Right. So you returned to this cottage with your family? Still in the family?
I'm going up there in 2 weeks to quarantine.
Oh, excellent. The return to Canada. So,
Yeah.
wow. That's fascinating. How has the media is obviously not bothering you anymore in terms of like showing up with, hey, we're doing a retrospective historical of the, like you don't, like, you kind of have your personal life back, I imagine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I still wonder, the murderer got 17 years, which means he'll be out in 2030, which is not nearly long enough, but
Right.
he'll be out in a few years. And so I wonder what he'll think of the book.
Oh, wow. Wow. I have to ask, so what's next? You weren't expecting on writing a true crime book. The dream, and when you were a young girl sitting in the library imagining seeing your books on the shelves. What is next? Do you have other things that you're working on?
I have a second book, which is a fiction. And my agent has it and is about to start pitching it around. So I hope it gets published. But it has a lot of similar themes in that it's based on true stories and very horrifying true stories. As a publicist, I happened to be working with a law firm a few years ago, and they had a number of clients, middle-aged men, who came forward to file lawsuits regarding childhood sexual abuse in very elite, prestigious New England boys' private schools.
Oh,
And so I was reading through these complaints, and I just could not believe. I mean, you would not believe what these boys went through. It's almost, just beyond comprehension that these things were allowed, and everybody knew about it, and everyone was complicit. And anyway, I thought, here again are stories that have to be told and issues that we have to bring to light. So I kind of created a fiction, but based on these true stories.
oh, so okay, so it's fiction but inspired by. Okay, so the stories can at least come to light. Wow. Wow. I as a an experienced publicist, how did you apply your knowledge from other areas into the publicity for book?
Um, well, so as a publicist, though, I've always been very traditional. It's always been, print, broadcast, and the whole world of social media. I really didn't do as a traditional publicist years ago.
Right.
But as an author, I mean, you have to be on social media, and that's your primary form of publicity these days, and blogs and book reviews online and word of mouth, everything. So that was a bit of an education for me.
Wow.
I had to really get up to speed with that kind of stuff. But I also did manage to get a lot of print coverage of the book, and in Canada and in the States, and and also radio. I think radio is not dead,
Yeah.
and radio and podcast goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
and yeah, and then I also do a lot of in-person events, a lot. Like I've done 120 at this
Well,
point.
that must have slowed down a little bit since
Yeah,
since
yeah.
last year,
Well, switch to
2020.
Zoom.
Switch to
Switch to
Zoom.
Zoom.
Wow. But
But
I can imagine like local libraries and bookstores and other venues, right? Like, wow.
well, I do a lot of colleges and Holocaust museums, and with Zoom, I guess the upside is that I've been able to do a lot of United Kingdom events.
Yeah, of course.
So I've done a couple just this month. I have another one next month. So
Yeah,
at
I mean,
least,
I remember saying early in the pandemic, before the pandemic, you had to be local to get into a television studio to be on a morning program. Now, doesn't matter where you are in the world, you probably have just as good equipment as the person who lives in the city. So, yeah, that did change a little bit for us. And I wonder if
but there's nothing. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, there's nothing like being in front of a live audience where you can really connect with people and interact. And it's a very different experience. It's much more emotional.
oh, for sure. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I do ghost stories, and when you're telling a ghost story in front of a live audience, you can see who's connecting with you. when it's a Zoom, it's really hard to get that same sense if they're if they're not visible, or if they're this little, Hollywood squares kind of look and feel.
Yeah, and especially when you try to be funny and then it's just crickets.
Yeah, and I imagine telling such a tragic story, it's probably important to have those moments of comic relief, and because the tension can be probably too palpable at times for people, right?
I think so. I think
Wow.
so, yeah.
Wow. Well, Debbie, this was such a fascinating story. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Can you please let my listeners know where they can find out more about you and your book, or soon to be books, online?
Sure. Yeah, it's just my name, Debbie Levison, DebbieLevison. So no N in the middle. It's not Levinson.com. Debbie
.com.
Levison. And it's on the book's on Amazon, some bookstores, and all the other online retailers.
Awesome. Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There were a few things I wanted to reflect on from Debbie's experience. The first one, I want to call attention to the very first literary agent that she reached out to, and this is something that I've seen happen in the publishing community. The agent was too full, wasn't able to take her on as a client, but saw something good in her work. And agents and editors, they see thousands of manuscripts. So when they actually call something out as good, you know that they recognize that there's something inherent in the manuscript that they know will have a good home. And even though that agent didn't work with her, the agent worked with her, helped her, coached her a little bit, gave her some advice, and even connected her to another agent. Because again, that's the thing that people in the industry do, is say, well, I can't take you on, but I know someone who might. Now, while that didn't end up working out, which I'm going to talk about, that's my second reflection, I did want to call attention to that, because that's something that we see in the indie author community is people are helping one another out all the time. You have relationships between authors, you have relationships with editors and designers, and the retailers and distributors all kind of working together. And it's like, well, I don't have a book that I can use in this promo, but my friend does. That's the kind of thing that happens. And it happens in the traditional publishing sphere too. You have these agents who believe in something and want to work together and recognize, okay, this is a great book. It's not for me, but I know someone it might be for. So that's something I'm just, I guess I'm reflecting on the community and the collaborative community that I've long loved about the publishing industry. Now, the other thing is the issue that Debbie ran into, the Canadian publisher. Now, many Canadian publishers get grants to publish Canadian authors. I just want to share this reflection as the kind of the way the business works, so authors can understand. So if you're in Canada and you sign a deal with a publisher, with pretty much every Canadian publisher I've signed with, they sent me a waiver where I had to prove I was Canadian, and I know they use that to submit to the government because they get some sort of grant. That X percentage of their books are from Canadian authors. And I bet you it was a case where that Canadian publisher would have taken her on, but she was an American citizen at that point. So that would have meant them giving up the funding, which is kind of a frustrating thing for me to think about, because I know the Canadian market is significantly smaller than the US, and it is harder for Canadian publishers because, again, they're printing and warehousing books and they are investing a lot in it. But it's really frustrating because you're thinking, wow, would the business even operate if it wasn't getting funding from the government? Like, you're getting paid to publish the books as opposed to actually sell the books. So there's a part of my mind, the business aspect, that says, well, if you're not good enough to run a sustainable business, then maybe you shouldn't be in business. That's cruel. It sounds like I'm being cruel, but I do respect and admire the Canadian publishers I worked with, and hundreds of other Canadian publishers that I didn't have the chance to work with as a writer, but as a bookseller. And again, maybe that's a reflection of the fact that the Canadian population is, equivalent to the state of California, so it's a significantly smaller chunk of population. And considering how small the population is in Canada, we have actually a pretty robust publishing community, but that may be partially due to funding from the Canadian government to support the arts, which kudos to them for all the support. I know I get a lot of support through the public lending rights, etc. But that's just kind of an interesting thing. And then this smaller Colorado publisher took her on. And the issue on the flip side was, an American publisher is not going to want a novel or a book where it's set in Canada. Because, again, it's like, well, most readers have no clue what the geography is or where it is and stuff like that. So that's kind of interesting. I know my friend Sean Costello in the 80s had a great deal with Pocketbooks. So Pocketbooks, a major mass market publisher. And he did, his first book was actually set in Sudbury, Ontario. And the second book, I believe, was set in Ottawa, Ontario. So Sean grew up in Ottawa and then later moved to Sudbury, Ontario. And I think it was either his third book was already out, and then he was looking at his fourth book, and his editor in New York, because it was a New York publisher, said, okay, we can't do this anymore. No more Toronto and Ottawa and Sudbury. None of these foreign Canadian locations. We need this set in New York or Los Angeles or some major American city. Because, again, it's a marketing factor that publishers consider. And Sean said, screw you. And he walked away. It was also a time, I know, when his son was young. And he was like, nah, I'm a anesthesiologist. I'm working long hours as a doctor. My son is young. I want to spend time with my family. And then Sean returned to writing. About 10, 15 years later, he came back, and that's when he started self-publishing. And actually, that's when I met up with him. I think it was in person for the very first time. He was doing a book signing, and I was so excited because I was working at Chapters Indigo at their head office in Toronto, and I was like, oh my God, it's Sean Costello, and I got him to sign all the paperbacks that I'd had, the pocketbook paperbacks I had. And then I found out about this new novel he had released, Finders Keepers, and he's like, oh, I published it myself, and he used Ingram. Way before Spark, he was using Lightning Source. And that was partially what inspired me to self-publish my first collection of short stories in 2004. So Sean was very much a pioneer ahead of all the rest of us. And then later on, of course, we became good friends, and I became his digital publishing companion, taking care of all the digital aspects. Even though he championed it and pioneered it, he just wanted to focus on the writing, and I learned a lot more about digital publishing. So just sort of some interesting business aspects of publishing. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Debbie. I hope you enjoyed the persistence that she saw, and also the fact that she was a writer her entire life and dreamed of being a writer her entire life. And it was an ironic, incidental situation that happened at her family cottage that actually turned her from, a professional writer doing other writing in the industry as a journalist, as a publicist, into somebody who is publishing books. And I look forward to her next. I actually just got the audiobook through Kobo, and I'm started to listen to that, and I'm going to enjoy it. I'm already I'm into chapter 1 already, and so far enjoying it. And over the course of the next week or so, I know I'm going to enjoy that when I'm out for walks and driving in the car and all those other great things. So that is the end of my rambling reflection from this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Debbie. If you do like the podcast, please feel free to leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice, or better yet, share it with someone that you think would find value. So until next week and next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.